Now, please join me in welcoming this evening's lecturer, Lord Daniel Finkelstein, to give this year's Royal Historical Society Public History Lecture, Minor Criminal, the Trial of the Man Who Murdered My Grandmother. Thank you, Daniel.
Thank you. Well, first of all, Lucy, thank you so much for that introduction. I sound absolutely amazing, and I can't wait to hear myself. It's also very nice to do this in the middle of the city. I was recently asked to give a speech that took me to Norwich. It took me 4 hours to get there. There was only 2 people in the audience, and one of them was the person that had invited me. So I felt I had to say something, obviously. And at the end of it, I said to him, "Would you like to join the cause I was there to promote?" And he said he would, but it would interfere with the terms of his parole. So I was a bit nervous when I began to see those spotlights going around the hall. But I am honoured to have been asked to deliver this Colin Matthews Gresham public lecture. I've received much intellectual sustenance from this great historian and from the Gresham lectures, and it is a privilege to be asked to add my own contribution. Today, I'm going to tell the story of one of the great trials of the 20th century, a trial which was an important moment in spreading public understanding of one of the worst crimes ever committed, a trial that was a media sensation, splashed across front pages all over the world, and which left its mark on a generation. But oddly, a trial that was quite quickly overshadowed and is now rarely spoken of, to the point where even people quite familiar with the crimes it dealt with aren't familiar with their prosecution. I've chosen the Belsen trial as my subject, partly because its striking nature seems as obvious to me now as it did to journalists at the time, partly because it raises all sorts of moral and political questions that remain relevant, the examination of which is one of the purposes of a Colin Matthews lecture, but primarily because the Belsen trial is personal. The main defendant was the man who murdered my grandmother. At 11:30 p.m. on the 24th of January 1945, a train pulled into Kreuzlingen station just over the Swiss border from Germany. The train had originated in Zella, near Hanover, and had taken 3 days to arrive, diverting to Berlin and then edging its way through what was, by this stage of the war, the desolate and bombed German landscape. On board were 800 passengers, predominantly American citizens who'd somehow been trapped in Axis-occupied territory by the conflict and had been interned. They were generally in good health, but thrilled to be free. A minority, 136 people in all, were in a different state. No less relieved to be free, but as one contemporary news account recorded, shadowy, emotionally and physically broken figures. For they were survivors not of internment, bad as that was. They were survivors of the Belsen concentration camp. The observation that they were physically broken came from a Swiss man who saw the group disembark from the train. He said, "They moved past me like so many ghosts." But not every one of the Belsen group was able to do even this. For among them were some who had to be taken to hospital immediately on stretchers, and one of these was my grandmother, Margareta Wiener. Just past midnight, Greta died. She'd seen her 3 young girls to freedom, but she did not live to see them grow into full adults. She did not see them live full and happy lives. She did not live to meet her grandchildren. She was murdered, starved to death, when life still had so much to offer her. The homicide was intentional, committed by people who were quite content for her to die, had means to prevent her from dying, and yet who showed no interest in saving her. She was just 49 years old. If she'd lived as long as my mother did, she wouldn't have died until 1980. I would have been 18. I would have called her grandma. I would have played with her after school. As it was, all I was left was a few still photographs and what my mum had to say about her. A brilliant intellectual, a pioneer for women in academic life, a brave and resilient and deeply loving person, someone I'm determined to understand as an individual who was killed by other individuals, not just as a statistic or the unfortunate victim of the unstoppable forces of history. Exactly 11 weeks after Greta's death, on the 12th of April 1945, a man called Derek Singleton was standing in a roadside clearing on the road to Vincent in northern Germany, receiving instructions he thought bizarre. Singleton was a lieutenant in charge of a small unit that was part of the British Second Army. 44 years old, he'd been a journalist before the war and an author during the conflict of a book on Joseph Goebbels. By the spring of 1945, he'd not only read a great deal about Nazi brutality, he had encountered many refugees and deliberately heard their stories. Nonetheless, what he was about to encounter left him reeling. Singleton's unit was charged with dealing with civilian populations and relations with the enemy as the Allies advanced. The practical importance of this was that he had control of an armoured car with a powerful battery of loudspeakers and 3 linguists with command of several European languages. That is why he'd been called aside to receive new orders. The British had been approached, Singleton was told, by 2 Wehrmacht colonels making a surprising proposal. The British advance would soon take them to a clearing in the Lüneburg forest, and there they would encounter a prison camp with more than 60,000 people in it. The Germans were offering to surrender this camp and retreat behind it. Their reason was simple. A typhus epidemic was raging in this place they called Bergen-Belsen, and if the British and Germans were to fight there, the inmates might break out and typhus spread to soldiers and local citizens alike. Singleton was to go to the camp, drive through it, and use his amplifier to convey the message that the inmates were free, but that nonetheless they shouldn't leave. This was certainly a singular proposal. But what Singleton, with his journalist's sensibility and the reading he had done, found particularly odd is the idea that he would be greeted by SS guards and be expected to cooperate with them. There were still 3 days of fighting between Singleton's briefing and his entry into the camp, but his reception when he did arrive did nothing to reduce his bewilderment at the arrangement. In front of the main gates of Belsen stood a group of smartly attired SS officers, dark tunics, black peaked caps, breeches, and high boots. They were as urbane as they were beautifully dressed. They talked of their families and having served with crack SS divisions before coming to Belsen. They were friendly and genial, particularly their leader, the camp commandant, Commandant Joseph Kramer. They seemed to have no sense that this was a crime scene and that they were the criminals. Yet just beyond this greeting party lay the bodies of 10,000 unburied dead. There were corpses everywhere, inside the wires, between the wires, in the huts, between the huts, in the gutters. The stench was unimaginable. There was no water, no sanitary facilities, no food, and those who were still alive were dying. Indeed, many thousands more would die, even once the camp was fully under British control. This was the camp to which my mother Miriam had been sent by train on the 11th of January 1944, along with her 2 sisters and Greta. Many members of the wider family had by this point been, to use the Nazi euphemism, evacuated to the east. In other words, they'd been killed in the gas chambers of Sobibor and Auschwitz. But this fate, the Wieners had escaped. That is why they'd been transported to Belsen. In the 3rd year of the war, Heinrich Himmler had reached the conclusion that the Germans might not win, and he developed the idea of keeping some Jews as hostages, both to assist the war effort and as a hedge against losing. He might swap the Jews for money or weapons or Germans who'd been trapped in Allied occupied countries. To be an exchange Jew, you had to be a citizen of an Allied or non-aligned country or have useful connections. To hold these people, Himmler created a camp not far from Hanover, known as Bergen-Belsen, and it opened in the spring of 1943. My grandmother and her daughters were not citizens of an eligible country, but they had false Paraguayan papers that suggested that they were. These, the Nazis, keen for as many exchange Jews as they could get, were willing to accept. And so it was that Greta Wiener came to Belsen, the place that would kill her, when the gas chambers did not. And from the beginning, Belsen lacked everything that made any sort of life possible for any length of time. It lacked warmth, being bleak and cold. It lacked sanitation, being spectacularly ill-suited for accommodating anywhere near the number of inmates it had. It lacked healthcare, as disease swept through the camp. It lacked rest, requiring grueling work in terrible circumstances. It lacked humanity, as the guards beat their charges and lined them up in all weathers for hours for pointless and often sadistic roll calls. And most important of all, it lacked food. One assessment, made in the summer of 1944, is that there was a deficiency of 1,000 calories daily per person, and things got worse after that. My Aunt Ruth kept a diary, and often the entry recorded that no food at all had been distributed, not even the usual tiny ration of bread, not even the cup of turnip soup that was close to water. From this treatment, Greta died. Even though she was one of only a handful of people who was involved in an actual exchange, freedom in January 1945 still did not come soon enough. By the time she died, she'd suffered kidnap, theft, extortion, false imprisonment, and murder, and tens of thousands of others suffered the same fate. But it wasn't only the SS officers with their amiable chitter-chatter who weren't sure a crime had really been committed against Greta. The Allied leadership and forces weren't sure either. The basic problem was that the punishment of war crimes after the First World War had been a disaster, and the Allies were keen not to repeat it. After Germany's defeat, David Lloyd George, the British Prime Minister, had wanted to hang the Kaiser. He'd campaigned on it. Wilhelm would be tried for having violated the laws and customs of war and the laws of humanity. US President Woodrow Wilson did not agree. He thought it would be hard for any tribunal to find the Kaiser personally guilty, that it would create resentment in Germany, and that it would look like victor's justice. In any case, the Kaiser had already fled to neutral Holland. The US did agree to a formal attempt to extradite him, but it knew it would fail, and it duly did. This made the argument for prosecuting other officers and officials harder. It seemed unjust to hold the Kaiser's soldiers guilty when he himself had escaped proceedings. When the Allies demanded the extradition of 900 people men it wished to try, Germany simply refused. It probably would have been politically impossible for its government to do anything else. A compromise was reached, allowing Germany to try its own accused before its imperial court in Leipzig. Only 12 cases were ever brought, and there were only 6 convictions. Even for those, the sentences were light. The whole thing had been a farce. And one way of avoiding such a farce at the end of the Second World War was simply not to try. Simply avoid categorizing Axis actions as crimes and consider them instead as simple acts of war. As the war advanced, however, this position became increasingly difficult to maintain. The issue had started low on the agenda of the main Allied combatants, but it was high on the agenda of governments in exile. It was their territory on which the main atrocities were being committed, and it was happening to their people. Both their political pressure and the information they were providing proved hard to defy altogether. The Allies duly began to make general threats about the prosecution of war criminals after the conflict was over, but they avoided anything too specific. They had a practical concern that anything too precise might lead to harsher Axis treatment of Allied prisoners and might later make them look foolish. They had also failed to resolve any of the difficult questions about the nature of proceedings. To give a few examples, wouldn't it seem ridiculous to try someone like Hitler? It wasn't just that formulating a charge and constituting a court would be difficult. It was that the decision over his fate would ultimately be political, not judicial, and it would be wrong to pretend otherwise. So there was a strong lobby, with Churchill and Roosevelt part of it, simply to shoot the major leaders of the Nazi government once they were caught. But if a list of war criminals was drawn up, should they say that Hitler was on it? If it was acknowledged that he was on the list, then what was the reason for withholding other names? Yet if they refused to acknowledge that he was on the list, were they letting him off? And what about German soldiers? At one point in a dinner held towards the end of 1943, Stalin proposed executing 50,000 officers and liquidating the German general staff. When Churchill responded sharply, Roosevelt suggested compromising and shooting only 49,000 people. Churchill stomped out of the room and Stalin had to run after him, seeking to persuade the British Prime Minister it had all been a joke. And Churchill was never entirely sure that it was. Later, Stalin retaliated by throwing his weight behind a trial for the main war criminals, something Churchill had been against. So the main parties disagreed, and they didn't have time or inclination to conclude the debate, all of which meant that the war came to an end without many of the major questions being resolved. And one of them was whether it had been a war crime to kill Greta. It was a war crime to breach the established rules governing war by, for instance, ill-treating hostages or killing prisoners or plundering property. Greta had obviously been a victim of all of this, but she'd been a German before the war, having her citizenship removed by the Nazis in the month before the conflict began, and during the war she'd been stateless. The Allies couldn't come to an agreement that ill treatment, imprisonment, even death, visited upon people who weren't party to the war could be considered a war crime. They were nervous about war crimes trials enough without adding the novelty of trying Germans for atrocities against their own citizens. And there were other dangerously novel elements to consider. The Wiener family had fled from their home in Germany in 1934 under considerable pressure from the Nazis. There hadn't been a war then, so how could that be a war crime? On top of everything else, declaring it a war crime to kill a stateless person would be to charge someone with breaking a law that wasn't a law when they broke it. So, as Singleton stood outside the gates of Belsen with a smiling Kramer, the status of the offences against Greta were unclear. But moments later, as the British proceeded into the camp, what did become clear is that they were visiting the scene of one of the worst crimes of the 20th century, accompanied by one of its greatest criminals. Camp Commandant Joseph Kramer was 38 years old in April 1945 and had made being a Nazi his career. In 1925, he'd lost his job as an electrician and he hadn't found another one for 9 years. He'd been forced to live at home with his parents, which he found degrading, and the National Socialist Party in many ways had saved him. After he joined it in 1931, he'd first found male companionship, and then, upon joining the SS, a steady job. He wasn't a particularly political person, but he began to appreciate that his experience, an experience of humiliation and poverty, was that of millions of others, and Hitler offered a way out. In Kramer's case, that way out came with a steady income and a solid, middling sort of status such as that his father, a mid-ranking public official, had once possessed. He never questioned any of it or anything he was asked to do. At first, there was little occasion for him to do so, but later, well, he wasn't really the doubting kind. His early SS years were spent mainly as an administrator, first in Dachau, later in Sachsenhausen. In these jobs, he was aware of what was going on in the camps, but not directly involved. But in 1938, he achieved his first position involving overall responsibility for a camp. He became deputy to the Commandant of Mauthausen. Further promotions and further training followed before, in July 1942, Kramer achieved his own command. He became the Commandant of Natzweiler. By this point, he almost certainly knew of the programs of mass murders, but after August 1943, there's no longer any room for questioning that. For in that month, he supervised the gassing of 80 prisoners in the concentration camp, sending their bodies, as instructed, to the University of Strasbourg for scientific research. At his trial, he would say, "I didn't feel anything. I received an order to kill the prisoners, and that's what I did." This attitude made him perfect for his next assignment. In May 1944, he was sent to Auschwitz to become the Commandant of Birkenau. He'd been brought in to supervise the liquidation of Hungary's Jews in the gas chambers. and he was not a distant presence. He was directly engaged in the physical act of murdering tens of thousands of people. It was only with the advance of the Red Army from the east that Kramer ceased his work in Auschwitz, being allocated instead to Belsen. His skills, apparently, were needed. He was a tough, experienced and disciplined administrator, and Belsen was in danger of collapsing into chaos. What had started as an exchange camp for Himmler's hostages was rapidly becoming the dumping ground for every kind of starved, beaten inmate of the entire camp system. It was in the middle of Germany, and it would be among the last to be overrun by the Allies. The first Commandant of Belsen, Adolf Haas, wasn't considered strong enough to handle this new situation. So at the end of November 1944, Kramer replaced him. That is why he was there to meet Singleton and his amplifier at the gate in April 1945. After the initial bizarre exchange, Singleton signals his intention to take his lorry through the camp as planned. Kramer warned against it. Not because it would reveal the extent of the atrocity he was presiding over, since he seemed supremely unbothered by that. It was more that, as he told the British, everything was quiet at the moment, and their experience would cause a tumult. Singleton proceeded in any case, and Kramer jumped on the running board. Crowds gathered in their thousands, surging forward as Germans fired at them and overseers hit them with sticks. Now the tumult is beginning, Singleton recorded Kramer as saying, adding that the Commandant had spoken with the dismayed solicitude of the expert whose advice has gone unheeded by an inexperienced superior. This characterized Kramer's attitude during all the coming hours. He felt it was hard enough to keep discipline in a camp with all these people fighting for food, and the British were making it harder for him to hand over an orderly Belsen. Kramer and his officers were indignant at the disruption caused by the loudspeakers. The British had disorganized everything. Singleton later in the day came across them trying to restore their form of order by shooting dead 7 or 8 prisoners who were searching for potatoes. It was only possible for the British to stop this by threatening to fire back. None of the Germans they encountered seemed to have the slightest sense they'd done anything wrong. When Singleton made his way out of the gate, his announcements having been made, he shouted to a saluting Kramer from his lorry that he seemed to have created something close to hell. Kramer bridled. The camp had only become bad recently, he said. He looked, said Singleton, offended, as if I were an inspecting officer blaming him unjustly for a faulty turnout. At 10:30 in the morning of the 17th of September 1945, in a converted gymnasium on the outskirts of Lüneburg, about 50 miles away from Belsen, began the trial of Joseph Kramer, and with him 44 other defendants. After the first hours of following him as he strutted round the camp, Kramer had been arrested, and after his officers had been put to work burying the corpses of the people they had killed, his staff had been arrested too. The question after that was what to do with them. The public exposure of the scenes at the camps, David Dimbleby's famous report, a short movie reel shown in British cinemas and then later around the world, changed the debate around the prosecution of war crimes. With millions of British citizens watching bulldozers shoveling corpses, hearing talks of smells and sounds horrible beyond belief, it was no longer plausible that those directly responsible would avoid prosecution, even if that idea had ever been realistic. The problems thrown up by the First World War trials couldn't be solved anymore just by ignoring the whole question. The issue instead became how rapidly and in what form prosecution would begin. The attempt to put off serious discussion of the matter until the war was over ceased, because the war was coming to an end and the problem was urgent. This didn't, of course, by itself resolve some of the tricky questions of precedent and retrospective lawmaking. But most of those need only be answered in order to try what were considered the major criminals, the arch criminals like Hitler and Goering and Ribbentrop, who'd started the war. Kramer, the murderer of my grandmother, the man who almost starved my mother to death as well, was a minor criminal. This did, of course, leave the question of whether he was simply an officer obeying the orders he'd been given, and that would become one of the major issues in his trial. In the days after liberation, British officers had begun to take witness statements. It was a relatively informal exercise whose primary purpose was to understand the crimes that had been uncovered. The most important thing it made clear is that by the end of the war, the camps at Belsen and Auschwitz were linked. The very reason that Kramer had come to Belsen was to supervise the detention of tens of thousands of Auschwitz prisoners. Some had already arrived, resulting in the chaos that the new commandant was charged with eliminating. But after Kramer came, tens of thousands more prisoners marched there under the supervision of SS guards. So the witness statements told of cruelty and death caused in both camps by the guards that were now under Kramer's command in Belsen. The officers were less yielding. They mostly denied individual acts of cruelty, and Kramer, who'd been in charge of Birkenau, denied knowing anything about the gas chambers at all. One other thing became apparent during this early collection of information. Many witnesses were not able or willing to stay to appear in a trial. It wouldn't be practical to keep them at Belsen until proceedings were underway. It was going to be necessary to take their evidence in a formal way and allow documents to be used in the trial, absent the witness. Together, this information determined the next steps. The British government decided it would issue a royal warrant, which it did on the 18th of June 1945, that would allow the creation of military courts to try those accused of war crimes. The questions about retrospective law and the treatment of German nationals and stateless people would be overcome by restricting the courts and charges to those accused of crimes against Allied nationals and those in occupied countries. The murder of Greta would, in other words, not be prosecuted. But the murderer of Greta would be. In May 1945, Lieutenant Colonel Leo Gen, already present at Belsen, had received a secret telegram. He was ordered to form and take command of a new unit, the No. 1 War Crimes Investigation Team. This would proceed to collect, in an organised and proper way, the evidence to allow a trial to go ahead for the crimes perpetrated at Belsen and Auschwitz. There needed to be a properly assembled case strong enough to withstand the sort of bland denials the officers were making. Jem was an impressive man. He was a barrister and already an accomplished actor. He'd been in Laurence Olivier's Henry V, and after the war, he was successful enough in Hollywood to be nominated for an Academy Award. And he collected together an impressive team of interrogators and linguists. The evidence taking itself, however, was less impressive. The team was able, but, as explained by Thomas Harding in his account of the life of one member of it, it was handicapped by the fact that the army gave them no help beyond the use of officers in Belsen. No typewriters, recording devices, intelligence support, vehicles, or communications equipment. There also weren't enough staff, and the witnesses kept leaving. Not only have many of the horses gone, Jen lamented to headquarters, but I doubt if I have the necessary strength to shut the stable door on those that remain. Nonetheless, Jen's team quite rapidly assembled more than enough evidence of war crimes, turning the handwritten informal notes into properly witnessed affidavits and interviewing the officers that had been arrested in Belsen. For the most part, the evidence from Belsen was unsurprising to the investigative team. They could see it themselves simply by walking around the camp. It seemed fairly obvious that harsh measures would have been used to keep any sort of control when keeping people in such inhuman conditions. But the stories of the Auschwitz gas chambers that the officers finally began to admit to were startling. Here were the stories of selection for death, medical experiments, and mass murder on an unthinkable scale. There had been rumours, but what the investigators were being told surpassed the rumours. They were soon able to go back to those officers who'd been denying any crime and challenge them. In particular, they challenged Kramer on his denial that he had knowledge of the gas chambers. Kramer indicated that given the weight of evidence, he was willing to talk. In an affidavit that would shortly be central to his trial, the Commandant admitted that he'd been the head of the section of Auschwitz-Birkenau that contained gas chambers within it. He claimed, however, that Rudolf Höss, the overall Auschwitz commandant, had retained overall control, that he, Kramer, had no discretion and no involvement in determining who would be gassed, and that even Höss was acting just on the orders from Himmler. My feelings about orders in regard to the gas chambers, said Kramer, were to be slightly surprised and wonder to myself whether such action was really right. Perhaps he thought this claim was exculpatory, but as Harding recalls, the effect on Leo Gen and his interpreter was the opposite. They concluded that Kramer was not just physically aware of what he was doing, he was morally aware. So here he was, Joseph Kramer, sometime commandant, 10:30 a.m., 17th of September 1945, standing for the judge's entrance into court with a number hanging from his neck on a piece of cloth, on trial for his life. Kramer was not standing alone. Standing alongside him in the dock were those of the arrested officers and camp supervisors that the investigators believed to be guilty of the most serious of the crimes that they had uncovered. 44 others. Dr. Fritz Klein, a doctor who had conducted medical experiments in Auschwitz. Irma Grazer, just 21 years old, accused of being among the most cruel of the Auschwitz and Belsen guards. Elizabeth Volkenrath, also young, only 23 years old, who'd headed the women's camp, each with a number to allow identification in what promised to be a complicated trial. Almost all of the 45, save one supervisor, were charged with crimes at Belsen, while 13 were charged with crimes at Auschwitz too. And naturally, Kramer was in this latter group. Being accused of the most serious crimes was not the only criterion for being in the dock. The other was that the British had to have you under arrest. Kramer's predecessor, Haas, had fled, and along with him, many other Belsen offenders never faced any sort of court. Standing also at this time were the British officers appearing for the defence. There were 12 in all. Major Thomas Winwood, a county solicitor by profession and disposition, was one of them. The Major had seen a notice in the early summer of 1945 from British Army headquarters requesting the names of serving officers qualified as barristers or solicitors. He lamented later that he ignored the first rule of army life, never to volunteer, and having qualified as a solicitor only in 1938, sent in his name. 2 months later, he was ordered to report to RAF HQ in Zelle, and when he got there, he was informed that as he was there first, he would get the first on the list, so he would be defending the Commandant of Belsen. He had 30 minutes to read the papers and then was taken to see his clients. He would be defending 3 other people as well as Kramer, and the trial would begin in 7 days. And finally, standing also were the 400 people filling the public gallery, and a large group of reporters filing for newspapers and broadcasters all over the work. Grazer, because of her blonde hair and striking looks, became a particular focus of attention. The numbers in the gallery fell off after a while, but the trial remained a sensation throughout its tenure. Later, the Belsen trial came to be overshadowed by Nuremberg. The point came, in fact, when it isn't much remembered except by scholars. But at the time, it was different. The Belsen trial was the first moment when the crimes of the Holocaust and the evidence supporting it were revealed in court, and made the impact you might expect from such shocking revelations. It was a shocking story, but a story as yet little known. When one of the first witnesses, Ada Bimco, talking of conditions and killings in Auschwitz, spoke, the judge advocate felt clarification was needed. Where exactly, he asked, is Auschwitz? After early legal skirmishes over trying Belsen and Auschwitz defendants separately, for example, a request that was denied, the trial moved quickly to the substance of the charges. Colonel Tommy Backhouse, a barrister from Blackburn, opened the prosecution, Leo Gen by his side. His aim was to use Gen's investigation to prove a concerted effort, uniting the defendants in a common endeavour, and his approach was relentlessness. First, in his initial speech, and then with the witnesses he called, Backhouse told one story after another of shootings and whippings and beatings and ill treatment. Knowing that Kramer would argue that starvation and illness in Belsen was not his fault, that he had in fact complained to headquarters, as he had, about conditions in the camp, Backhouse asserted that what had gone on had not been mere neglect. It was death, he said, by deliberate starvation and ill treatment with the malicious knowledge that they must cause death and lasting physical injury. His first witness, Brigadier Glyn Hughes, the main organiser of British medical support after Belsen's liberation, said that he had in fact found plentiful food and medical supplies under Nazi control in the local area that had not been used. He described Kramer as quite callous and indifferent to the enormous suffering around him. Another crucial early witness was Dr. Ada Bimko, a Polish Jew whose entire family had been gassed in Auschwitz. She testified directly that she'd seen Kramer on the station platform when trains arrived at Auschwitz. Selections for the gas chamber were made and, quote, I saw the accused Kramer present on several occasions at these selections. The defence in cross-examination and later in the trial tried hard to undermine this evidence and other similarly direct accounts. They argued, for instance, that hunger could produce hallucinations and that witnesses wanted revenge and distorted the truth to get it. They had some success undermining the written evidence of those who'd not stayed to give evidence in court, but Bimko was articulate and certain. She wasn't an easy person to ignore. Nor did the court find it easy to ignore the film of Belsen, played by the prosecution, or the evidence of such witnesses as Anita Lasker. Some of the lesser defendants might be able to argue that individual acts of cruelty had been incorrectly ascribed to them, but for Kramer, such deflection was impossible. Instead, he and his lawyer, Winwood, on his behalf, tried two tacks. The first is that he was merely obeying orders. This became known as the Nuremberg defence, but first it had been the Belsen defence. Kramer's argument was that he believed in the Führer principle. This meant he was bound not only to follow an order, but to believe that if it came from the Führer, it must be right. He wasn't as convinced, though, about Himmler. As he finished the opening statement on Kramer's behalf, Winwood said this: finally, in his last days, Kramer stood completely alone, deserted by his superiors, while these waves of circumstances beat around him. Since the date of the liberation by the British, Joseph Kramer, former Commandant, has been branded throughout the world as the Beast of Belsen. When the curtain finally rings down on this stage, Joseph Kramer will, in my submission, stand forth not as the Beast of Belsen, but as the scapegoat of Belsen, the scapegoat for the man Heinrich Himmler, whose bones are rotting on Lüneburg Heath, not very far from here, and as the scapegoat for the whole National Socialist system. His other line of defence was that he did his best in difficult circumstances. In Auschwitz, he was only doing his job. In Belsen, he was struggling against forces beyond his control. Winwood, on behalf of his client, took it into his head to try to excuse the chaos in the camps by saying that the type of internee who came to these concentration camps was a very low type, and I would go so far as to say that by the time we got to Auschwitz and Belsen, the vast majority of the inhabitants of the concentration camps were the dregs of the ghettos of Middle Europe. My grandmother, I should point out, had a PhD in economics. That a British officer should say such things, whether under instructions or not, caused huge offence. And the resulting fuss in Britain ensured that in future war crimes trials, defendants would appoint their own counsel rather than have one provided by the British. But in addition to offending public sentiment, Winwood's arguments did not save his client. In fairness, it's doubtful if anything really could have. When, on the 14th of November 1945, the judge advocate came to sum up the case, he rejected both of Kramer's arguments. The Beast of Belsen was not the scapegoat of Belsen. It was, he said, settled law that officers are bound to follow legal orders only. And while he allowed that witnesses could be biased and written affidavits were a dangerous way to proceed, he regarded it as clear that the accused had been involved in gassings, beatings, the use of savage dogs, and the overworking and underfeeding of internees. On Friday, the 16th of November 1945, the courts went into private session at 11 a.m. and emerged at 4 o'clock in the afternoon. In short order, Joseph Kramer was pronounced guilty on both the Auschwitz and the Belsen charges. The next day, it was announced that he would be hanged, along with 10 others, including Klein, Grazer, and Volkenrath. It was a cold, damp day in December, a little after a month from the sentencing, when Albert Pierrepoint, the British state hangman, appeared in Hamelin jail to carry out the sentences. When Pierrepoint weighed Kramer, he noticed that he'd lost 2 stone since he'd been captured, but he remained powerful. Klein, who was hanged with him, barely came up to his commandant's shoulders. Pierrepoint reported that he felt relief when he had tied Kramer's wrists safely behind his back. Every Christmas, after the December in which he hanged Commandant Kramer, Albert Pierrepoint received an envelope. It contained just a £5 note. Only the first one had anything else in the envelope by way of identification or explanation. It contained a scrap of paper, and on it the scrawled word, Belsen. This then was the story of the trial of the man who murdered my grandmother. It lasted for 6 weeks, and in 45 minutes it wasn't possible to provide anything like a full account. I decided to explain the trial in its context rather than take you through every day of thrust and counter-thrust in court, and I hope you feel that was the correct choice. There's still a bigger story to tell, but that'll have to wait for another occasion. Let me finish instead with some short observations. First, one of the great concerns about the war crimes trials was that they would be seen as victors' justice. And of course, the Belsen trial was victors' justice. I mean that in the literal sense that it only took place because Britain was victorious. The Belsen trial was only possible because Britain had Kramer under its command. They couldn't and didn't try those that they didn't hold. When we talk loosely of the international legal order, we don't often note that such an order can only be enforced if we have police. The justice that was meted out to Joseph Kramer was avoided, for instance, by the Soviets who imprisoned my father and worked my paternal grandfather to the point of death, because the Soviets were victors too. Second, the story of the Belsen trial shows the power and importance of developing international law. The Belsen trial had to proceed without the later rules governing crimes against humanity. This meant that the murder of my grandmother went unpunished, even though the criminals were convicted of similar crimes committed against others. The development of international criminal law may be at an early stage, and its imposition may currently be highly political and unsatisfactory, but it is still something we should aspire to perfect. Thirdly, the sentences at Belsen raise questions about capital punishment that I admit I'm still struggling with. I've always been a strong instinctive opponent of capital punishment. Yet I've never doubted that it was right to hang the Nuremberg defendants, and I felt the same about Kramer. I've always complacently satisfied myself with the thought that the case against someone like Kramer differed not merely in extent, but also in nature, because his guilt was so clear, which it absolutely was. But reading the trial's transcript made me realise that all the arguments about identification and mitigation that are raised in more mundane murder cases were raised in the Belsen trial too. Derek Singleton, the first British officer at Belsen, became a committed opponent of capital punishment. And in his book on the topic, he included a chapter on Irma Grazer. He said that to the crimes of Auschwitz and Belsen, immense and unsurpassed in their horror, had been added a vile deed in Hamelin, a deed with its own special brand of wickedness, its own particular aura of evil. I understand his disgust. I share his feeling that there's something deeply repulsive about capital punishment. But am I really wrong to be satisfied that they hanged Kramer? Finally, I want to add this. Common to almost all the literature on the Belsen trial is the sense that it was something of a failure. It was slapdash. It failed adequately to reflect Jewish suffering. It was a farcical way to deal with a crime of such magnitude. It was naive. And it would be so easy to go along with all of this. After all, it was a trial of my grandmother's murder in which it didn't prove possible even to include that crime in the charges. But I'm my mother's son, and I was brought up to have a sense of proportion, to appreciate when people are trying hard in difficult circumstances, and never to be too censorious when things that are good aren't perfect. So I end with these words. In all the circumstances, I think they did pretty well. Thank you.